Hello. All right. I didn't realize I'd hit the start button, but here I am. And I don't think I'm going to go back. No going back now. So it is 11:05 and I was doing nothing. I was sitting here at my desk. Actually, I was doing something. I was messing around with the demo that or what I wanted to talk about today. I'm gonna do a little bit of iPad work. So I was sitting here messing around on the iPad and I didn't realize that as much time had passed as had. All right. So hopefully everything's set up correctly, and I'm hoping that I don't get stuttering. Sometimes if I don't start a few minutes early on the stream, I get some video stuttering. Um, if I do end up getting a little bit of you know choppiness in the video feed, just be patient with it. It should go away, and I'm trying to figure out why the video tends to do that. But hopefully, it looks like I'm all right. Looks like it isn't happening today. Um, so this is the Thursday live broadcast. Normally on these Thursday live broadcasts, what I would like to do is talk about your work. So if you have work that that's in process, or that you've work in progress, if you have work that's in progress or that you've recently finished, send me images at dablon@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to talk about them on this broadcast, talk about what's working, what's not working, break them down in terms of just basic design principles, how they're functioning as pieces of visual communication. And if there's something in particular that you are not sure about, or that you would like to hear more about, or just get a first response on, indicate that in the email. And it could be of any medium, any level of experience. I think we all benefit from seeing each other's work, no matter what experience level you're at. I am going to turn off. Okay, hopefully that will solve my problem. All right. So that is what I would normally like to be doing on these Thursday live broadcasts. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different, and on occasion I will slip in a little bit of my thoughts and ideas, and maybe some discussion on other artists, or artists from art history, or just things that I think generally might be useful to you in your efforts to make artwork. Today I'd like to return to the iPad. The iPad is I I'm increasingly enamored with what it can do as a tool, as a diagnostic tool, as a way to experiment with not just digital rendering, but as a tool to help us get a better view on different perspectives on what we're doing with traditional materials, with paint and canvas. So I'm gonna, and I've used one of these Thursday broadcasts to talk about the iPad in the past. But I was tutoring somebody yesterday. I do offer private instruction via Zoom or in person if you're in the LA area. And I was tutoring somebody about their artwork yesterday and using the iPad to explain something. And just once again was kind of enthralled with just how helpful it can be to see the changes actually made on the artwork in real time and to be able to see the comparison between the two. So anyway, I was thinking that today I would explore some more ways that we can use the iPad to strengthen and understand what's going on in our studio artwork, our non-digital artwork. So I'm going to talk about that. First, I wanted to, what was it? Oh, fifth episode of my podcast, Dabble On, is live, and you can find Dabble On, the podcast, on iTunes. If you would give me a 5-star rating on iTunes, that'd be very helpful in getting the podcast in front of more people. In the episode for this week, I'm talking with Rob Holmsey, who is a ceramicist, just talking about materials. And he's one of my, the newest addition to my studio, one of my studio mates. So I think you might enjoy that if you like watching these broadcasts. Also, this past weekend was my first live in-person workshop. And in fact, for the past 3-ish years, before COVID, before I started teaching online, I was teaching at a high school full-time. And this was really my first in-person studio art class with adults, which is a very different crowd since before I taught at the high school. So it was a wonderful return. It felt so good to have people in the studio making artwork. I always enjoy working with adults because there's a little bit more life experience there. Anyway, it was a fantastic time. I have 3 more workshops coming up very soon. The next one is happening a week from this Saturday. So not this Saturday, but next Saturday. It's going to be focusing on resin. So resin as a material, not just as a finishing glossy coat, which I think most often we think of resin being in art, in studio art. But resin is actually an extremely versatile and useful material. And in this workshop, I'm going to be exploring some of the ways that you can use resin in your artwork. And again, not just as a top coat, but as for its structural quality, and also the different kinds of visual effects that you can get with resin, different levels of transparency, different kinds of textures that you can get with resin. It's just a wonderful, wonderful material. So if you're interested in resin, I have spots open in that workshop coming up, again, a week from this Saturday. I will be posting some pictures from the workshop that happened this past week. It was a mixed media portrait workshop, which was fantastic. We had a lot of really, really good artwork come out of that. And I'd love to share some of that with you. So pay attention to my Instagram feed, and also if you want more information and announcements as they come out, make sure you sign up on my email list, which is at dabbleon.com. And in addition to the resin workshop, I also have a mixed media figure drawing and mixed media abstraction workshops also coming up. I'm doing about 2 workshops a month. And I still have a few spots in each of those workshops. So if you're in the LA area, in Santa Monica, my studio's in Santa Monica, definitely check those out. And I'd love to have you join. If you have any questions, you can contact me at dabbleon, DABBLEON, at gmail.com. So that's the update about workshops. And without further ado, let's get into some discussion on about iPad. I'm going to switch my screen over here to my iPad screen, and I've grabbed an image off the internet that should be familiar to everyone. It is The Starry Night by Van Gogh. And I thought this would be a particularly good example to use for some of the things that I wanted to address in particular today. So one of the things that I tend to return to often in art classes is this idea of focal point. So I was talking to my daughter the other day. She was doing, and my daughter's 10 years old. She was making this painting. She was asking me for, my opinion. Rarely does she like my opinions. But I once again was, she felt like there was something missing, but she didn't know what. And this is, no matter what age or experience level, there's often this feeling of like, there's something that's not quite right. It's not, I don't know what it is, but it's missing something, right? And I think more often than not, that something that is missing is a focal point. And the reason we don't quite know what it is because it's not exactly easy to point at what ought to be the focal point sometimes, right? But we have this vague notion that it's not quite right, it's missing something, because, and again, I think there's a psychology in there, so that's why I'm kind of waffling, trying to find the right words. But I think we've got to give our viewers a reason to look at the image, right? A reason to look at the painting or whatever it is, the artwork that we're creating. And if there's no clear destination, if there's no clear focal point, no clear one spot in your image that is significantly different or remarkable compared to everything else, there's this feeling like the viewer doesn't know what they're supposed to be looking at, right? Let me turn off my notifications real quick here. Turn on do not disturb. Okay, hopefully that stops my notifications. So without focal point, we get this feeling that we don't quite know what this thing is all about. And the problem is, as an artist, you get to decide. It's up to you. You get to decide what this image is all about. And when I asked my daughter, well, what is your painting about? Or what do you want me to look at? And, she comes back at me with, well, I don't care what you look at. It's up to interpretation. There is no meaning. It's just abstraction, things like this. And this is unfair to my daughter, perhaps, to be using her as an example, but these are the same types of responses I get from students at, again, any age, any experience level. They hesitate, or they don't want to be, have to commit to what this artwork is about. They want to, there's no right way to look at it. They want the viewer to bring their own interpretation, and that's all fine and good. But I think it is irresponsible to think that way. And I think you are depriving yourself of a chance to make some kind of impactful communication. So even though your viewer is going to come at your artwork with their own background, it's up to you to be as clear as possible about making a visual statement, communicating something. You're asking for your viewers' time. You got to tell them what they're supposed to be paying attention to, why they should spend their time and attention looking at your artwork. All right. So that was a big soapbox, but focal point's very important. In this painting by Van Gogh, there are potentially many focal points, right? There's a couple clear ones, clear candidates that pop out immediately. But I wanted to talk or to talk about how we can manipulate focal point using some of these tools on the iPad. I'm going to be going through these tools on the iPad fairly quickly. Don't try to remember everything. You can always go back and look at what I do. And the intention here is not that you would go in and use everything that I do, but hopefully I'm introducing you to some tools or techniques using the iPad that you will find useful. I'm saying all this because I know that it might be overwhelming to some of you who aren't very comfortable using the iPad or technology in this way. But I would highly recommend that you just start trying. Just take little bits and pieces, stuff that makes sense to you, and start giving these things a try. Because over time, you'll start to get an intuition for these things and build up your knowledge. So hopefully, even though I'm going to go through a lot of some fairly advanced techniques, you'll find some use here. Okay, so let's look at The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. What is the focal point? A couple different candidates. I'm going to pull up a color here that is a little easier to see. We've got a big dark shape right up here in the foreground. We've got this shape right here, a big plant in the foreground. It's dark. It's fairly solid. It occupies a lot of the surface area of our composition. And it's in the foreground. It's closest to us as the viewer. It's kind of occupying our space. Our eye level, perhaps, we're looking down on this town. So our eye level is probably somewhere up here, right? We're up on a hill somewhere looking down at this scene, right? So that could be a focal point. It's big, dark, monolithic, and it's occupying our space. We also have all of this movement, all this motion in the sky. We've got this big swirl that is like a big, singular shape. It's pretty close to the center of the composition. It's fairly large, like that tree is. It's a lot of movement, a lot of busyness. So that might be considered a focal point. But it doesn't have a lot of saturation. Well, it's got saturated blue, but then you've got these areas like the moon and the stars, right, that are those really saturated yellow colors. They're also circular, and things that are circular, our points, are going to lock our attention or pull us in. But really, those are the candidates in my mind looking at this image. This big dark shape in the foreground, this bush, the moon is probably the second, and then my eye, maybe this big swirl is third, and then it's a kind of toss up between all the different stars, and maybe we bounce around between the different stars. Right? So, but I would say definitely, I would not say that anything down here at the bottom in the town, nothing down there really grabs my attention nearly as much as up here in the stars. So what I would like to do is talk about how we can experiment with not adding anything per se to the composition, not adding any more stars or suns or texture, but using some of these tools in this application on the iPad to manipulate, to kind of adjust what's already there to change or maybe strengthen focal point, right? And I'll explain what I mean as we go along. So the application that I'm working in today is called Procreate, Procreate. It's a digital painting application on the iPad. One of the best. There's 2 or 3 others that are also up there and used a lot, but Procreate is a really great application. I think it's fairly inexpensive, like $20, well worth it, and they keep on developing the app in really great ways, and it's a really strong tool. All right, Enough said about that. I've talked about this in the past, but this much of what I do today is going to be reliant on an understanding layers. So up here in the top right-hand corner, there's this palette, these two squares that are overlapping. That's a layers palette. And essentially right now I only have two layers. I've got this layer that is the painting image of the painting. And if I turn that layer off by unchecking it, I've got a background layer that's just white, a white background color. If I turn that layer off, then I get this just grid of, actually I think on your screen it's probably just going to appear as a gray screen, but I see this grid of light squares, and that just means it's transparent. So I'm going to turn on my background color and layer. So I've got two layers at the moment. Right now, this layer number one, that is the painting, I get a little thumbnail of that layer, is what is selected. So that is what I am working on at the moment. Whichever layer selected is the layer that I'm currently working on. All right, so that's important because I'm going to show you how we can isolate the sky. So just like I was saying, there's a lot of stuff going on in the sky and in this foreground plant. I'm going to leave the plant alone, although I could, do stuff to try to make the plant more stronger as a focal point, but I'm not going to do that. So what I'm going to do that is I'm going to select the sky using the selection tool, which is this little S shape in the top left, this little S icon at the top left next to the arrow icon. And that's going to bring up these options down here. I'm going to choose freehand, and this is, again, the selection tool. And I'm just going to use my pencil to draw, and you see this little dotted line up here. I'm going to draw around the edge of this plant and around the mountains, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to separate out the sky. Okay, and I'm going to go up around the top of this sky shape and back to the beginning of my selection. So now I have a dotted line, these what we used to call dancing ants or marching ants in Photoshop. But that is telling me that right now I currently have this area selected on the layer that I'm currently working on, which is this painting layer. All right. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to tap on this little, actually, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to tap on the little wrench icon. And in this first thing where it says the blue selection is on add, it's going to give me an option to copy. So I'm going to copy. So it just copied that area that was selected with the dancing ants or the marching ants. Now I'm going to go over to the layers palette. I'm going to hit plus to add a new layer. And that layer is just transparent. There's nothing on it at the moment, right? But I have it selected. And now I'm going to go back to that wrench over in the top left and hit paste. And it looks like nothing happened, right? Looks like nothing happened. But if I go back to my layers palette, what I can see is now I have a layer on the very top of that layer stack that's just the sky, right? So if I turn off the original image, I can see that on the very top of that layer stack, I've got a layer that is just the sky. And then again, if I turn off the background white layer, you'll just see gray, right? Okay, so why does this matter? Well, what it does is it allows me to adjust the sky on a separate layer without messing anything else up or without changing anything else. Okay? So it's just a way that I can isolate this one part of my image, and I could have isolated this part of my, the original image, that original layer, by just making the selection and making a change. But it is a lot easier, and I can do some really cool things by isolating this layer. or isolating this part of my image onto a layer. Okay, and hopefully this will make sense why this is helpful in just a second. Okay, so now I've isolated the sky and everything that's in it, everything that it was in that selection originally. I put it on a new layer, and what I'm going to do is with that layer's now selected, I'm going to go back or over here into this little magic wand menu, and in here I've got some ways that I can adjust this layer, all the information on this layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose hue, saturation, brightness, and tap on layer to make it so that I'm making a change to anything that's on the currently selected layer. And I'm going to take down the brightness, right? So check that out, how I can take down the brightness of that layer to make everything darker. And I'm also going to take down the saturation so it's not as, the colors aren't as intense. And now notice how when I darken everything in the background, it starts to sit back, right? Light values tend to want to pull forward, dark values tend to want to sit back. And then all of a sudden, these areas down at the bottom, the mountains, and all this information in this city down at the bottom become more visible, more important, right? I'm shifting the focal point. I'm shifting what is being communicated as most important, right? So high value contrast, saturated colors, lots of really busy, contrasty information, that's going to grab my attention, right? But if I subdue that by darkening everything up there in the sky, then all of a sudden now it's being de-emphasized. It's becoming less demanding visually, and that's allowing other parts of the image to start becoming more important or more of a focal point, right? All right. So that is one way that I can use this this tool of having it on a separate layer. I'm going to click out of that, go back to, it doesn't matter, any other tool. And what I can do now is go back to my layer palette, and I can turn that sky on and off to make a comparison between the original image and then now this darker sky on top of it. So you can imagine if you're working on a painting and something's not quite working right, or the background feels like it's too busy or jumping out, or you have a part of your image that feels like it's distracting in some way, you could take a picture of it on your iPad. You can go in, select that part, cut and paste it onto a new layer, and then mess around with making it darker or a different color or more contrasty or less contrasty to see how that affects the overall composition and what is where your eye goes, right? How it reads, specifically with regard to focal point, but also just in general, how it affects the overall feel of the composition. All right. So I'm going to get into something a little bit more complex. Let's take a look at the time. Okay, I'm doing all right. So I'm going to actually undo what I just did, and I'm going to bring back, so I still have that layer. No. I'm going to undo until okay. Now I've got that layer that I put on, that the sky on the separate layer is back to its original state. I still have it on a separate layer, but now it's back to how it was originally in the painting. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer in my layer palette. So now I've got layer 1, which is the original photograph of the painting, layer 2, which is where I have the sky, just the sky isolated, and now I'm adding a third layer, which is on the top of the stack. Remember, the stacking is just like you're putting pieces of paper on top of each other. In this case, I'm putting a transparency on the top of the stack. And then what I'm going to do is in that layer, with that layer selected now, I'm going to choose kind of a mid-gray. And what I can do is I can just click and drag from that gray. Whoops, I don't know why it went back. So now I've got that gray, and if I click and drag from that gray and drop onto my image, it will fill that whole layer with that color. It's kind of a cool thing. Click and drag from the little color swatch in the top right and drop it on the layer and it'll fill the whole layer. So now everything's gray. Oh no! But not everything's gray, just everything on that layer. So if I turn that layer off in my layers palette, you can see that those other layers are still there. They're just being covered up by that solid gray, right? Really important to understand this idea of layers. And again, if this is if this is just way too complicated, drop me a comment in Facebook or wherever you're watching this, or send me an email and tell me to cut it out if I'm being a little overly complicated. All right, so going back to this layer, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click on where it says layer 3. Tap once where it says layer 3, and all of a sudden I get a little menu that pops up. One of those menu items is called clipping masks, or clipping mask. So what I can do is I can hit clipping mask, and what a clipping mask is, it's brilliant. It's really a powerful tool. It's kind of complicated. But what it does is it applies whatever is on that layer that I just created a clipping mask. It makes it so it only will affect the layer that's right below it, right? So remember, on this layer below, I only have the sky. So it means that that layer is only going to is only going to affect or be applied to the parts, of the layer below it that have information on it, have image on it, right? That aren't transparent. So that's why I only now have gray on the sky area, because that gray layer is only being applied to or covering up the sky layer on right below it. And you can see that it's a clipping mask with this tiny little, there's a little arrow that's kind of comes out and points down. And that tells me that layer 3 is now a clipping mask, meaning that it's only covering up the layer that's right below it. Anything that's not transparent on the layer right below it, so the sky. All right. Maybe sometime I need to do a demo just on clipping masks and showing you how they affect the layers. But for today, I'm just going to do that. Okay, so I've added this gray layer as a clipping mask to the sky. And why am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to show you. Next thing that I'm going to do with that gray layer selected is there's a little N icon, or letter N, on that layer. And that, if I tap on that, I get a whole new set of options. Starts to get complicated. Hang in with me there, though. If I tap on that N, I get these options that pop up. One of those is opacity. So I can change the opacity of that gray layer. And you can see as I change the opacity, now I can see the sky layer that it's covering up right now. But I don't want to do that. What I want to show you here is that I can change the blend mode. So the blend mode is how one layer is interacting with another layer, how they're blending together. Right now it's set to normal, which is why it says N on the layer right now, N for normal. Normal just means it's like a piece of opaque paper that's on top of it, right? It's not blending in any way. It's just one layer sitting on top of the other, right? I can change the opacity, but other than that, there's no real interaction between those two layers. But I can change it to all these other options. There's darken. Darken means it will only affect the colors on the layer below that are lighter, and it will make them darker, right? It won't make anything lighter. Like you see the dark black on that sky stays black. It's not getting any lighter. It's not affected by that gray because it's darker, right? It's only going to darken things. Color burn, and there are resources online that will let you see what each one of these blend modes is doing, how it's making the two layers interact, and I'm not going to go through all that. But essentially, you can go right down the list and see how these different blend modes are going to affect how that gray layer is interacting with the layer right below it, right? And you can see as I kind of go through this, wow, how it totally changes the image, right? So remember, this is just that gray layer with a blend mode applied, and having that sky blown out like that, really white and washed out, totally changes the composition, right? Totally changes the feeling of the overall image. So again, I can go back here, and it's the little letters say DI, and that's for divide. But I can go through all of these different blend modes and see how that affects my composition. So same thing as if you're working on a painting, you're stuck, it doesn't look really good, it doesn't look right, you can bring it in here, isolate the part of your painting that's not working right, and just going through the different blend modes, apply a gray layer or a colored layer, and then go down through those different blend modes, and you'll get so many different ideas and be able to see in real time different versions of your painting, seeing which ones work, which don't work, and you're going to come up, it's going to give you ideas that you just wouldn't have come up with on your own, right? So blend modes are a very, very powerful tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this top gray layer to be a multiply layer, and that essentially is just multiplying the layer, the gray layer, with anything that's below it. So darks get even darker, lights get darker. Essentially, they're multiplying the value of the value of the top layer with the bottom layer, so everything kind of gets deeper, darker, richer. All right, so now I can see how. Remember, I can turn this layer 2 on and off. If I turn the layer 2 off, it's going to by default turn the layer 3 off, because right now layer 3 only affects layer 2. So if layer 2 is not there, the gray is gone too. So I can do a before and after. So I set that gray layer to a multiply layer, and what that did basically is it just made the whole everything a bit darker. So and because it's gray, it didn't change the color of anything. It just kind of made everything a little bit less contrasty. Okay. So now I've de-emphasized everything in the sky. I've made everything a little bit less contrasty, right? The lights and the darks are closer together. They're less contrasty. And value-wise, right? Light and dark. So that's going to just, whenever we decrease the amount of contrast, we're going to decrease the amount of emphasis or interest, visual interest, right? Contrast is what creates perception. It's what grabs our attention. So by decreasing the contrast there, I'm allowing other parts of the image to pull forward and to become more noticeable, right? Now by contrast, this land area down at the bottom, just like I was talking about earlier, starts to become more visible, more pronounced, more attractive, because it's not overwhelmed by all that contrast and busyness in the sky. So that might be a way, let's say, instead of making the sky so dominant, Van Gogh, what he really wanted to do, maybe, hypothetically, this is not what he really wanted to do. This is not art historical information, but maybe he really wanted to get us to look at this church down in the village, right? So I de-emphasized the sky, and down at this church, I'm going to, let's go in and I'm going to add a new layer so I can add some detail on top and not have it part of that clipping mask. What if let's see, make my brush a little bit smaller. What if I add a little bright highlight on the side of this church steeple that's being lit by the moon, and a highlight on this side of that roof and on the side of this roof, right? So all of a sudden that church is starting to stand out more, and maybe inside the church there's a warm glow. I'm going to pull that maybe a little bit of yellow. Maybe inside the church there's a meeting going on, and so there's this warm yellow coming out the windows. I'm going to make the window over here a little bit less dominant because I want people to really be paying attention to that doorway. Or maybe that is a doorway in the back. Maybe I got things reversed. And maybe I'll bring a little bit of kind of a red in there too, or a red-orange, with all those blues around in the surrounding area. Kind of these warm, saturated colors are going to have a lot of contrast with that. Right? So now, all of a sudden, that church is starting to stand out more. Whoop. The church is starting to stand out more. Sorry, I turned my phone on airplane mode so I don't get distracted. The church is standing out more because I've created more value contrast between the white steeple and the surrounding saturated colors, saturated dark colors. And then I've added a complementary color in the entryway and in the window. I've got the orange, yellow-orange, again, kind of a complement with the blues and greens around. And I've also made that a fairly light value as well next to all these dark values. So now I've got that steeple or that church area that becomes more of a focal point, right? So de-emphasize the background that was overwhelming and then start to emphasize the church. And the church is also fairly centered in the overall composition, so that's also in its favor. Okay? So just by manipulating, de-emphasizing, and emphasizing without adding anything necessarily, not adding any new objects or features or elements, but just kind of finessing or polishing, just adjusting these basic value relationships and relationships of contrast, I can dramatically change how we read or interpret what we're seeing, how the focal point. All right. So I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to turn that layer off. So the church goes back into obscurity. We're not really paying attention to that anymore. What if instead of this area down at the bottom, I wanted to have the moon be really a lot more powerful? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase this multiply layer, that gray layer. I'm going to get the eraser, go to that gray layer, and I'm going to erase out where that gray is covering up the moon. And all of a sudden that moon is starting to pop because it is now much lighter. There's a lot more contrast between the moon and the rest of the sky, right? Without that gray layer there, that moon just kind of is equal in contrast in the paint application and the energy of the brushstrokes. It's equal with all the stars and this big swirl in the sky, right? But if it's appreciably lighter and more contrasty compared to everything else, all of a sudden it becomes much more of a focal point, right? Which is kind of cool. Now the moon is really popping, right? I still have all this brushwork and the energy and the brushwork in the sky, but the moon is really standing out because it's significantly lighter in value compared to the other values surrounding it. And then what I can do is, oops, I just added too many layers. What I can do is maybe take some of that yellow from the moon, and I'm going to make it a little bit more green, maybe a less saturated. And let's say that I'm going to have that moon hitting this tree. I'm going to make that brush a little bit, or this bush a little bit more directly. I'm going to add some of these highlights to the side of this bush to kind of give us the sense that the moon is that light, yellowish light coming from the moon is lighting up the side of that bush, right? Maybe that's a little overkill, a little too strong perhaps. I'm going to blend it in a little bit. But now I have this primary focal point that is probably the moon, and then a secondary focal point where I've got this really bright green, yellow-green edge that's being lit up by that strong moon light source, right? And there's this primary focal point, secondary focal point, and this dynamic between those two in terms of light logic, right? One is affecting the other, so we can start to create a relationship, right? A light logic relationship, and start understanding kind of that dynamic, and that becomes more important to the overall visual statement or what this image is about, right? And let's just for fun turn back on the church down there in the distance. See, now the moon, I would say, is still kind of the primary focal point. And I might change my mind on that. In the moment, I'm feeling like that bright moon is probably more dominant than the green on the bush. And actually, you know what? With that bush layer selected, I'm going to go into the magic wand and adjust the brightness of that green. I'm going to take it down just a little bit, and the saturation I'm going to pull down a little bit, just so it's not quite so lime green. It's a little bit more subdued, not as contrasty, and that feels a little bit more comfortable. Okay. So now I've got this really cool dynamic, or this cool, I don't know, narrative happening where the sun or the moon is lighting up this foreground bush, and those two things are framing this church that's off in the distance. So there's this kind of primary, secondary, tertiary narrative happening, right? How I'm reading or interpreting what I'm supposed to be paying attention to in this image, right? And you know, I think let's see. I think generally, I'm not saying this is better. I'm not saying this is an improvement, or this is the way that Van Gogh should have painted this image. But I will say that I think that this, as a visual statement, as a story being told, is a little bit more clear, right, in terms of how I'm supposed to read it. This now is less about this starry, starry night. So maybe that's a more accurate way of saying that, right? So in his original composition, if I turn off all of these changes that I've made, right, this definitely feels like it's about that sky, about the starry, starry night, right? And it's not about the moon as, like, really. I mean, the moon just feels like it's a pier of all the stars and of this Milky Way or whatever that swirl is. It feels like it's a pier with all those things. So this painting really is about, and accurately titled, it's about that starry night, right? That's where we're spending our time. That's where we're bouncing around in between these circles in the sky, this pattern of circles, and we're not really paying so much attention to the landscape, the city, or the bush in the foreground, right? But turning these changes that I've made back on, now it becomes about this, what's going on in that little church building in the distance, right? It becomes about maybe about the moon and how it's relating with this bush in the foreground, and how those things are framing this scene in the small town in the mountains or whatever in the landscape. All right. So just to review what I've taught you here today, and hopefully you can see how these tools wouldn't just be useful in this one particular case, and you wouldn't necessarily have to use all of these tools that I've just taught you, but hopefully you can see their application in helping you get different perspective on work that you're working on in the studio, actual, like, physical paintings. Hopefully this was instructive. So what I've taught you about is hopefully layers, so understanding layers, how you can make a selection of part of your image on a layer, copy and paste that to a new layer so you can isolate that part of your painting and just manipulate that part without changing the whole painting, right? I taught you about clipping masks, how you can have one layer affecting just the layer below it without affecting anything else, right? I've shown you how you can use some of the different tools to adjust hue, saturation, brightness on whichever layer that is currently active. I've taught you about if you tap on the title of the layer, you get these different options. That's where the clipping mask is. And if you tap on the letter that's on the layer, you can get the opacity adjustment and also these blend modes. And you can use blend modes to come up with ideas that you would have never come up with on your own, just by changing how these two layers of information are being combined or blend together. So those clipping masks are, I think you would classify them as an advanced technique. I don't see too many, beginners or people that are, not familiar with Photoshop or, haven't been doing this for a while. Don't see too many people that aren't really comfortable with digital rendering using clipping masks, but they're so cool. You can do so many cool things with them to isolate part of your composition. So clipping mask, blend modes, selection, cut and paste, layers. It's a lot there. It's a lot of complication, but hopefully that at some level, hopefully you got some ideas on how you can use the iPad to study, to get new perspectives and new ideas for work that's happening in the studio in traditional media. I guess the focus here today was also thinking about focal point, how we can clarify focal point by emphasizing and de-emphasizing without really adding anything, just making adjustments to the relationship between different elements in our composition, making things a little bit darker, less contrasty, to de-emphasize, or making things more contrasty to emphasize. And with those little adjustments, we can strengthen focal point, clarify focal point, or completely change focal point, right? What used to be a painting about the starry, starry night, right, with all this sky, this energy in the sky, became much more about the moon, that foreground bush, and the church in the background, right? The starry sky was still there. It was just de-emphasized and comparatively not as dominant, vying for our attention. All right, so that's it. Go take a listen to my podcast, Dabble On. You can find it on iTunes or at the website dabbleon.com/podcast. If you want me to talk about your work, send it my way at dabbleon@gmail.com, dabbleon@gmail.com. I can do something similar to what I did today. I can dig more into these techniques of using iPad, or I could just use Photoshop to show you what's working or what's happening in your image, how it might be improved, or just talk about what's working well and why. And hopefully with that discussion comes better understanding and better control over creating compelling images. All right, you guys, I think that's it. If you're interested in the workshops, make sure you go to the website dabbleon.com/workshops. You can email me with any questions. I'd love to hear from you. The email is dabbleon@gmail.com. And I will be here again next Thursday at 11 a.m. Los Angeles time. Come visit me at the studio. Sign up for one of the workshops. It's so much fun. So much fun to have people in the space for live art making in person after a year of isolation. All right, y'all. Thanks for joining me today. Hopefully it wasn't too arduous with all that talk of layers and clipping masks and such, but hopefully it was helpful. All right. Take care of yourself. Have a good week. And I'm signing off.